Ooh, it's the Tin Hifi P1. So if you've been following this channel, you might have noticed I'm kind of a fan of Tin Hifi. About a year ago, I reviewed the Tin Hifi T2, gave it 5 stars. A couple months later, I reviewed the Tin Hifi T2 Pro, also gave that one 5 stars. And then about 6 months ago, Tin came out with the T3, and I also gave that one 5 stars. So now they've got a new model, and is it gonna get 5 stars? I have no idea at this point. So this thing is actually pretty different from those other models. Both are the T2, the T2 Pro, T3, all very similar sound signatures and very similar price range, around $50 to $70. The P1, I have a feeling this is gonna be quite a bit different. So one, these things are not $50 to $70. The P1 is clocking in at around $150 to $170, kind of depending on where you buy it. So that's not cheap, but the big difference here is that this is using a planar driver, which is pretty unique in the IEM world. There's a couple other IEMs out there that use planars, but it's very, very uncommon. Typically you've got dynamics or balanced armatures. So I'm interested to see what Tin has done with this particular driver technology. So I don't know, let's go ahead and open up the box. We'll find out what's inside, and then I'll spend some time living with this headphone, this earphone, and I'll come back and I'll let you know, is it 5 stars again? All right, so I've been spending the past about 2 weeks listening to the Tin Hifi P1, and that's a little bit longer than I typically use, or a little bit longer than I typically take to do a review, right? Typically I'll get an earphone and I'll spend about a week with it before I come back and I'll let you know how I feel about it, but this is a complex one, right? This is an earphone that has got kind of a lot of hype right now, which can cloud your opinion about it. But also just like my own personal opinion about this earphone changed pretty quickly. When I first started listening to it, I had one impression, and then fairly quickly it turned around and my impression was a little bit different. And I wanted to take that extra time, that extra week, to go back to some of my other favorite earphones, spend some time listening to those, compare them back and forth. And this is stuff I normally do, but I wanted to spend more time doing that to make sure that the opinion that I come at you guys with is just a lasting opinion. It's a real opinion, and it's not just clouded by either hype or how pretty these things look. But yeah, like I normally do, we can start by talking about how pretty these things look. And frankly, I think they look pretty. The P1, I think is, yeah, it's a pretty nice looking earphone. You know, it's got this all stainless steel coloring to it. The shape of it is, it's not particularly stand out or that interesting. Yeah, aesthetically, I think it's pretty nice. I think aesthetically, the cable is also really nice looking, but I do think that they are lit down a little bit in the build quality or just in some of the details. So, for example, if we start with just the buds and looking at them, yeah, they are nice and they've got a nice weight to them without feeling especially heavy. But just some of the edges of the casing, right? It's two halves of the metal casing is basically two halves that are held together. And there are just a couple of spots where you can see that the halves don't line up quite perfectly. Is that a big deal? I don't know. It just, you know, for $170, which is what these things are gonna retail for, you kind of hope for, you know, basically, you don't want those kind of flaws, and they are here. The good news is I didn't really feel them on the inside of my ear, which is where they could really become a problem, because those edges are not, I don't know, where those things meet, it does create kind of little sharp edges, but again, I didn't feel them in my ear, so at least it's got that going for it. The general fit of these things is fairly good, but it's not a strength of them. You know, if you're listening to something like Shure earphones, or, you know, I like the Shozi Neo CP or the Meizu Live, I really love the fit of those. These things, they fit okay, which I think you could also say about the Tin T2, is it fits okay. The isolation's not the strongest, and the stems, I think, are just not quite long enough. I would like the stems on these buds to be a little bit longer, and I think that that would allow them to create a more secure fit. And hopefully, I don't know, I'll show you what they look like on my head. I feel like they kind of like dangle out a little bit to the edges. Big deal, I don't know. The cable, I mentioned that I think it's a pretty attractive cable, at least sort of from a distance. But there are, you know, like the buds, there's some details that let the cable down. In fact, I think the cable's a little bit more of a mess than the build quality of the buds. The wind, basically it's just the wind of these wires is not very tight. It's pretty loose. The cable's pretty soft and like it behaves well. So that much is going for it. It's just, I don't know, goofy complaints that most people are not going to care about, but when you handle a lot of different IEMs, there are things that start to stand out about this, and so it's just not my favorite cable. That said, Tin Hifi does seem to have a tendency to improve their cables over time, so if you're watching this video like a year from now, there's a good chance they've actually replaced the cable and it looks similar but behaves better. I don't know if they're actually going to do that, but just saying that they've done it before. If we look at the accessories that the P1 comes with, it's not a ton, but it's a pretty decent selection for the price. So you get a bunch of different ear tips, including I think some narrow bore and some wide bore silicone tips, as well as one pair, actually two pairs, two different sizes of foam tips. Those foam tips, I actually found they're some of the nicest foam tips I've got. But then the silicone tips that these things come with, I think, well, there's the narrow bores, which I think are pretty common, but the wide bores, the tips are especially short. And to me, that seems like that could be an issue with creating a nice, secure fit. Like I mentioned, the stems on these things are not very long, and having those really short, narrow bore tips on them, I think is kind of a bad idea. I wish that Tin had packaged just kind of more normal wide bore tips on them. To the extent that, you know, I thought it was an issue that I actually went and put different tips on here. So these are actually the tips that came with the FLC 8P. I like these tips quite a bit, but they didn't come with the P1. Let's see, the only other really strong accessory that these things came with is that little carrying case, which I think looks really nice. It's got a nice build to it. It's got a magnetic lid, which I like, but it's just a little bit bigger and bulkier than I typically like for carrying around my earphones. I think it's nice that it comes with it, but probably not something I'm gonna end up using much. So if it sounds like I'm a little bit lukewarm on the build, that's kind of true. Like again, I think it's a good looking earphone. Some details let it down. And when I initially started listening to this earphone, I think some of that was clouding my judgment maybe a little bit, but also just like the general initial impression of this thing, I thought it was fine, but it wasn't knocking me out, right? If we go back to the Tin Hifi T2, it's a much cheaper earphone, yes, but in that price range, like it really knocked me out. That is just such a good sounding earphone for that price. These things costing 3 times as much, expectations change, but also like it's just the sound signature here is actually quite a bit different than on the T2. So if you're a big fan of the T2, it's not guaranteed that you're gonna like the sound signature here. But if you had issues with the T2, you might be happier with this. So again, my initial impressions of the sound were just kind of a little bit underwhelming. You know, it's fairly flattish sounding, right? The bass on the T2 was not something that was very emphasized. In fact, a lot of people wish that that earphone had more bass. I don't think these things really have much more bass than the T2. And then the treble, that's kind of the big difference between these and the T2, at least just kind of tonality wise, is that the treble is much more subdued here on the P1. So that's an area where the T2, if the treble was too much for you, I don't think you'll have an issue with the treble here. But it does give it kind of a duller, flatter sound versus the T2. But I wasn't really ready to just wrap up my sound summary there. So just for context, when I was getting that impression, I was listening to it with the stock foam tips, and I was listening to it on my Sony Walkman, which is what I usually use to listen to most earphones. It's my favorite player right now. But knowing that these things take actually kind of a lot of juice to get some volume out of them, the Walkman can get them plenty loud, but knowing that they need some juice, I tried them on some more powerful players. So I plugged them into my Schiit Valley amp, which you can see over here in the corner. I also swapped out the tips from the stock foams to these silicones, just because I know that silicone tips tend to give you a little bit more bite and a little bit more contrast in the detail, while foam tips tend to kind of smoothen out sounds a little bit. And then I started just also giving these things a little bit more volume. And that's where my impression of the sound of the P1 started to change quite a bit. So let me give you an analogy real quick, all right? I bought this thing just for this analogy. A lot of the times when I'm listening to earphones, you know, earphones that don't have a particularly strong sound stage or image separation or anything like that, they'll sound kind of like this, where I couldn't say that the details aren't in the music, it's just they all kind of sound like one thing. And this is kind of how the P1 started out for me, where everything was there, and tonality wise, I thought it was actually pretty strong, but just in terms of the sound stage or the separation of everything, it felt a bit two-dimensional like this. But this is something that I've experienced on some other earphones, and particularly more with headphones, frankly, is that when you hook them up to a nice amp, something like the Valley, or even just, you know, my Cowan player, which has got a high impedance mode and a little bit more juice than you get with my Walkman, you start increasing the volume. So sometimes it will increase the sound levels, but sometimes it'll also have the effect where the sound just starts to do one of these things, right? And it's not that you're changing the character of the sound so much that, you know, you're hearing different things or anything like that. It's just that the space between the sounds tends to increase. That's what, in my experience, a nice amp will do, is it tends to increase the space in the sound. It's, again, not changing the tonality so much, not giving you more details, but it's just picking out those details a little bit more engaging. And that's what I found with the Tin Hifi P1. So a lot of people are gonna tell you that this earphone requires a lot of power. And that's kind of true. Like, I can listen to these things off my iPhone or my Samsung S10e, and these things will get plenty loud. They'll get louder than I'm really comfortable listening to them. But what they don't quite do with that volume is this, right? They don't quite expand like this until you give them a nice, powerful source. At least that was my experience. And is that something that I can recreate in a lab? I don't know. How much of that is my personal, just kind of placebo effect? I don't know. Frankly, I really can't tell you. And I would be kind of skeptical of anyone that could really tell you until we find a way to measure this sort of thing. But that is definitely my impression. As far as like the sound staging of the P1, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like this level of sound staging. Like this is COS KSC 75's levels of sound staging. It's more about like here, but it's enough that you start to feel the dimensionality of the music. And this is feeling a little bit, I don't know, what am I, Carl Sagan or something here? But that's how I feel about listening to the P1. So I just got done talking a lot about the dimensionality of this earphone, but I haven't really told you what it sounds like. And I would say that, like, tonally speaking, this is just about perfect. Like, it's a fairly flat sound signature, at least if you see it on a graph, right? The bass is not especially elevated, but it is a little bit north of neutral. If you're looking for a really bassy earphone, I don't think you're gonna get it here, but I do think that the bass impact it's pretty solid. And for my taste, it's just about perfect. And then you get to the lower treble region, which is, you know, typically where like the high end of vocals are gonna be landing, or especially sibilants. And I think that that lower treble region, which is where the T2 is pretty hot, these things are actually pretty tame. The treble kind of drops off pretty steeply there. And you can see that on a graph, and you can definitely feel that when you're listening to it. It doesn't feel like the treble's gone, not by any stretch of the imagination. Like, this is not a complaint at all, but it doesn't feel like the treble is being pushed forward into the sound mix the way that it does on the T2s. But where I think this earphone really starts to get me is that in the upper treble region. So like, I don't know, past 10K. And again, I'm making up these numbers because I don't really know, but around 10,000 hertz, the treble picks back up and it comes back into the mix. And that gives me a nice sense of detail, a nice sense of space. It makes things like hi-hats, or, you know, if you're listening to like a trap music with like the little drum kits, like that kind of stuff comes forward in these earphones pretty nicely. And I think it gives me all that sense of space and detail that I want in treble without the heat that you get on something like the T2. I'm not saying that I don't want that heat in the T2. Like, there are other earphones that I like that have that heat. You know, I just recently reviewed the FLC 8P. That's a very hot treble earphone, and it's fun. But here, I think the treble is just about perfect. I mentioned the bass is not especially elevated, and again, for me, it's just about perfectly punchy. It's maybe a little bit soft in the bass region, if I'm perfectly honest. I don't think the bass is the strongest aspect here, but there's enough there, and that lack of treble heat tends to just make it sound overall like a pretty full sounding earphone. Enough for me that I'm happy with the sound of the bass. If you're a bass head, you might be let down, but if you just want like a nice supporting bass, I think you'll be pretty happy with it. And then the mid-range, because there's not that treble heat and there's not a ton of bass here, this becomes, I think, a pretty mid-centric sound. There's not a lot of emphasis in the upper mid-range, so vocals don't come forward of the sound, or they don't come forward of the instruments. They sound pretty well layered into the mix, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, kind of depending on your tastes. The lower mid-range is not scooped, like it doesn't feel scooped at all, so it does have a little bit of a warm character to it, but it's not too much. And I think that cool upper treble tends to counteract the warmth of the mid-range, and it allows it to have that mid-range warmth without feeling cloudy or congested. The overall, like, the way that I would describe the mid-range of this thing is not a cool mid-range. I think the upper treble gives it that cool character, but the mid-range is not cool. It's a very full-bodied, kind of an analog sound. Like, these things definitely sound more analog than something like a BA IEM. A balanced armature IEM sounds a little bit more digital, a lot faster, a lot more precise. And these things don't sound quite like that, but there's like a warm richness to the entire sound of this that I think is coming from that mid-range. And I find it, frankly, just one of the best sounds that I've got in an IEM. So that's the tonality of the P1, which I think is just about perfect. Again, like, when I was listening to this, that was my sort of second impression of this. And I really wanted to spend some time listening to other IEMs to make sure that I wasn't, I don't know, like fooling myself into falling in love with the P1. So I did a lot of A/B testing with this versus my favorite IEMs, versus, you know, the Tin T2, versus the Shozi Neo CP, versus the BG VP DM6, the Meizu Live, the Eco OH1, going back and forth with a lot of different things. And frankly, the tonality on these things is so spot on that it starts to make some of those other earphones, in contrast, sound a little bit weird, a little bit funky. And that's kind of an effect that I've noticed with myself before when I spend a lot of time with one earphone, is that it will sort of change your perception of sound a little bit to where that becomes normal, even if something else is objectively, technically more normal. And that's where I wanted to spend some time with those earphones, right? So I spent a day at a time with some of those earphones to the point where it would start to sound more normal to me. And then I would go back to the P1 and immediately the P1 would outshine those earphones. So I think there really is something here. I think that there really is something to the Tin Hifi P1 that is above and beyond most other earphones in this price range. And by in this price range, I really mean pretty much in my entire library, because I don't have a lot of earphones that cost more than this. This is just about the upper end of what I tend to spend on an IEM. And frankly, I'm pretty happy I did. So out of 5 stars, I'm actually kind of having a hard time with this one, but I think I'm gonna give the Tin Hifi P1 4 stars. I think that the demerits here are not insubstantial. The build quality of this is just it kind of lets it down a little bit. I think that aesthetically, it's a beautiful earphone. I think that comfort-wise, it's totally fine. I think that basically in all practical terms, you're not gonna have any issues with the build of it. It's just the details that let it down. This cable, it's kind of messy, kind of sloppy. And the build on the buds, right? The fitment is a little bit sloppy. I think that they can do better than that. And frankly, there's a good chance that they will do better than that in the near future. But when it comes to the sound signature of this earphone, I think I'm ready to say this is my favorite sounding earphone. I don't know, it's kind of hard to say something like it's my favorite sounding earphone, because there are so many other earphones that I've got access to, and there are different reasons that I will dip into them. But for just a richness of sound, a smoothness of sound, a sense of detail, and sort of like an analog, just really nicely textured character, this is by far my favorite earphone that I've got. It's not the biggest sub-bass punch, if that's what you want. There are other earphones out there. It's not the most detail in the treble. There are other earphones out there. It's not the most comfortable earphone. It's fine. But this really is, the P1 really is, it's just my favorite earphone to sit back, relax, and listen to. If I want to know what music sounds like, this is going to be kind of my new standard. If you're interested in checking out the Tin Hifi P1, of course, I've got links in the description below as well. I don't know, did you notice my new shirt? I've got merch, so if you want this shirt is available also below the video. While you're down there, you can hit the like button for the video if you liked it. You can subscribe to the channel, and then I'll see you on the next super review.